All right, let's talk about one of the biggest stories in American history, but we're going to look at it through a completely different lens. We're going to explore the founding of Jamestown not just as this big historical moment, but as what it really was, a high-stakes, incredibly risky business venture. So let's just jump right in with this question, right? Was America's first permanent English settlement actually a failed startup? I know, it sounds a little provocative, but when you really start to look at the money, the goals, the whole structure, the comparison starts to make a surprising amount of sense. This wasn't a government mission, it was a private venture, funded by people who were expecting to get seriously rich. So the investors in this whole story? They were the Virginia Company of London. Back in 1606, King James I gave them a charter, which was basically the green light to get started. Their mission was to set up a colony in North America, and believe me, their business plan was, well, let's just say it was ambitious. You can almost think of this as their pitch deck to their backers. I mean, look at these goals. This wasn't just about planting a flag somewhere. They were chasing the same kind of gold and silver the Spanish had found down south. They were hunting for that legendary Northwest Passage to Asia to completely change the game of global trade. And yeah, they wanted to harvest raw materials to make England less dependent on other European powers. It was a massive, world-changing gamble. Okay, so just a quick note here. Obviously, nobody back then was walking around talking about startups and pitch decks. We're using these modern terms as a way to frame the story, you know? It's an analogy that really helps us understand the immense pressures, the financial risks, and ultimately how this whole venture played out. So, the business plan is locked in. About 100 colonists set sail from England for the big launch. They land in Virginia in May of 1607, and almost immediately that glossy business plan just slammed headfirst into a brutal, unforgiven reality. I mean, the disconnect was immediate and just harsh. The spot they picked, while it was good for defending against Spanish ships, it was a literal swamp. The water was salty and contaminated, which led to horrible diseases like typhoid and dysentery just running rampant. Their plans for food were, to put it mildly, woefully inadequate. And maybe most importantly, they didn't land in some empty wilderness. They had just moved into the backyard of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, a very sophisticated society that wasn't about to just roll over. And it's so important to see this from both sides. For the English, the conflicts were these unpredictable, terrifying skirmishes. But from the Powhatan perspective, this was a strategic defense of their own land against foreign invaders. They weren't just attacking randomly. They were engaging in really complex negotiations, trade, alliances, but also in calculated military campaigns to contain or even starve out a presence that was becoming a serious threat. Things got about as bad as they could possibly get during the winter of 1609 to 1610. It's now known as the Starving Time. After Captain John Smith left, Chief Powhatan launched a full-on siege, cutting off all food to the fort. The colonists ate everything: their horses, their dogs, even their own leather shoes. This quote from the colony's leader, George Percy, confirms the absolute horror. They resorted to cannibalism. And this isn't just a story. It's now been confirmed by archaeological evidence. Just let that number sink in for a second. 88%. By the spring of 1610, out of the 500 colonists who were there the fall before, only about 60 were still alive, a mortality rate of 88%. By any business metric, any human metric, the project was on the absolute brink of total failure. But it didn't fail. Right as the last few survivors were literally packing up to abandon Jamestown for good, a supply fleet showed up. So the startup managed to survive, but it was crystal clear that the original business plan, finding gold, was a total bust. They needed to pivot. They needed to find a product that actually worked. And that pivot was tobacco. A colonist named John Rolfe started experimenting with a sweeter, more pleasant strain of tobacco from the West Indies, and it turned out to be a massive hit back in England. All of a sudden, Virginia had its cash crop. This was the profitable export the investors had been dreaming of, just not the one they expected. Tobacco didn't just save the colony. It gave it an economic reason to exist. But here's the twist. While the colony itself finally had a profitable product, back in London, the investors were facing a very different picture. The founding company, the Virginia Company, was still failing spectacularly. This timeline really shows how it all just fell apart for them. The company was constantly desperate for cash, selling stock, running lotteries, anything to stay afloat. Then, in 1622, a devastating, coordinated assault led by Opacheng Knopf, the new Powhatan leader, killed nearly a quarter of all the colonists. That was pretty much the final straw. 2 years later, King James had had enough. He revoked the company's charter and made Virginia a royal colony under his direct control. The Virginia Company was officially bankrupt. And that brings us to the core paradox of this whole story. The startup failed. The company went bust. Most of its investors never saw the huge profits they were promised. But the project it launched, the colony of Jamestown, somehow, against all odds, survived. And that survival would change the world. And this is where the story gets even more complicated. Because the legacy that grew out of the ashes of this failed business is a tangled mess of contradictions that, frankly, defines America to this very day. You can see that contradiction perfectly in the summer of 1619. Two huge, world-changing events happened just weeks apart. First, in July, the General Assembly meets for the first time, planting the seeds of American democracy and self-government. Then, in August, a ship arrives carrying the first captured Africans, marking the symbolic beginning of an institution that was the exact opposite of freedom. Now, their legal status was a bit ambiguous at first, but this moment was the start of a system of race-based slavery that would only harden and grow in the decades to come. So what you get from Jamestown's survival is this blueprint for so much of what came next. It gave America a model for representative democracy. It created the economic model for the South, built on a single, labor-intensive cash crop. And at the very same time, it established these devastating patterns of systemic slavery and the violent removal of native peoples that would be copied over and over again as the country expanded. Which brings us right back to where we started. Was Jamestown a failure or a story of survival? Well, as a business, it was a total disaster. But as a colony, it survived against impossible odds. Its real legacy is this deeply tangled knot of freedom and oppression, of incredible innovation and brutal exploitation. It's a story of both. Its failure and survival, all woven together right from the very beginning.